Picture the healthiest coral reef you have ever seen in a photograph. Walls of orange and purple, fish darting through branching thickets of living stone. Now picture that same reef 3 weeks later, after the water got hot. Bone white, ghostly, silent. That transformation is called bleaching, and it does not automatically mean the coral is dead. It means the coral has kicked out the microscopic algae living inside its own tissue, the algae that give it both its color and most of its food. Coral and algae have been running that partnership for millions of years. The coral builds a limestone skeleton and offers shelter. The algae turns sunlight into sugar and hand most of it over. It is one of the most successful roommate arrangements in the ocean. That partnership only works inside a narrow temperature window. Push the water even 1 or 2 degrees above the normal seasonal range for long enough, and the algae start producing compounds that are actually toxic to their host. So the coral evicts them to survive, and in the process loses its main source of food. A bleached coral can hang on for a while like that. It cannot hang on forever. If the hot water sticks around too long, the coral starves and dies, and an entire reef can go from a living, breathing city of color to a graveyard of gray skeleton in a single season. Have you ever wondered how many of those events a single reef can actually survive before it simply stops bouncing back? Marine heat waves used to be rare enough that a bleached reef had years, sometimes close to a full decade, to recover before the next one hit. That math has changed. Global sea temperatures have been climbing for decades, and the underwater heat waves riding on top of that warming trend are arriving more often, lasting longer, and hitting harder than they used to. Reef scientists have watched this shift happen in real time. In 1998, a single global heat event bleached reefs on a scale nobody had documented before. It happened again in 2010. It happened again, even more severely, in 2016, when hot water swept across the Great Barrier Reef. That 2016 event alone killed roughly a third of the coral on the Great Barrier Reef in a matter of months, and it was not an isolated tragedy on the far side of the planet. Palau, a small island nation out in the western Pacific, lived through the same pattern twice. Its reefs bleached badly in 1998, and again in 2010, both times pushed by marine heat waves that shoved water temperatures well past anything the local coral had ever experienced. Coral reefs are easy to think of as scenery, but they are closer to underwater infrastructure. They cover well under 1% of the ocean floor, yet they support something like a quarter of all known marine species at some point in their lives. Fish nurseries, natural storm barriers for entire coastlines, and the primary protein source for hundreds of millions of people all depend on reefs staying alive. So marine biologists have been sitting with an uncomfortable question for years now. If the ocean is heating up faster than coral can naturally keep pace with, is there anything else that could buy reefs more time? One answer borrows a trick that is thousands of years old, just never seriously tested on coral until recently. It is called selective breeding. Humans have been selectively breeding living things for nearly the entire span of agriculture. Farmers bred wheat that could survive drought. Foresters bred spruce trees that could handle brutal cold winters. Livestock breeders picked animals that resisted disease and quietly passed that resistance down the generations. The logic is simple on paper. Find individuals in a population that happen to be naturally better at surviving a specific stress. Breed them together. If the trait is genetic, their offspring should be better at surviving that same stress too, on average, than offspring from parents who were never selected at all. Scientists started calling the coral version of this idea assisted evolution, deliberately breeding the toughest individuals in a reef population to help it adapt faster than it ever could on its own. It sounds straightforward. It is not, for one very inconvenient reason. Before you can breed for any trait, you first need proof that the trait is actually heritable, meaning a meaningful share of the difference between individuals comes from their genes, not just from luck, location, or the particular patch of reef they happen to grow up on. And coral turns out to be a genuinely strange organism to test that on. A single coral colony is not one animal. It is a colony built from thousands of genetically identical polyps, tiny anemone-like creatures each with their own mouth and tentacles, all fused onto one shared skeleton. Coral colonies also take their time growing up. Depending on the species, it can take multiple years before a colony is large enough and mature enough to reproduce at all. When they finally do reproduce, it is one of the most striking events in the natural world. Once a year, timed almost perfectly to the phase of the moon and the water temperature, entire reefs release eggs and sperm into the water within the same handful of nights, sometimes the very same hour. How do you even measure heat toughness in an animal that is really thousands of genetically identical clones fused into a single skeleton? That measurement problem, stacked on top of how long coral takes to grow up, is exactly why nobody had ever nailed down the basic heritability question in adult, reproductively mature coral colonies. Earlier estimates came either from coral larvae, which behave very differently from grown colonies, or from bleaching responses measured without tracking whether the coral actually lived or died afterward. That gap is where a team of marine biologists working at the Palau International Coral Reef Center decided to start. They focused on one species, Acropora digitifera, a fast-growing, branching coral common across shallow reefs throughout the western Indo-Pacific, and one of the species that does much of the heavy lifting in building reef structure. To measure heat tolerance properly, reef scientists rely on a specific unit called degree heating weeks, which combines both how far above normal the water got and how long it stayed that hot. Similar to how a mild fever lasting a week feels very different from a severe fever lasting a single day. Field data from real bleaching events gives a rough guide to what those numbers actually mean in practice. Around 4 degree weeks of accumulated heat stress, a reef usually starts showing significant bleaching. Cross roughly 8 degree weeks, and widespread coral death becomes likely. During the 2016 Great Barrier Reef event, sections of the reef racked up around 8 degree weeks of accumulated stress, right in that lethal range. Palau's own bleaching events in 1998 and 2010 crossed into similarly dangerous territory. With that scale established, the Palau team set out to answer the question nobody had answered before in adult coral. Does selective breeding for heat tolerance actually work? They started by testing dozens of wild coral colonies, with 2 kinds of simulated marine heatwave in tanks. One was short and sharp, about a week at roughly 5 degrees Celsius above the normal local temperature. The other was longer and gentler, about a month at roughly 5 degrees above normal, meant to mimic what an actual marine heatwave looks like out on the reef. Each fragment of coral in the experiment was checked regularly and scored on a simple scale, from perfectly healthy, through partially bleached, fully bleached, and partially dead, down to fully dead. Based on how well each parent colony survived its heat test, the researchers sorted them into 2 groups, colonies with high heat tolerance and colonies with low heat tolerance. Then they did the breeding. 7 high-tolerance colonies were crossed with each other. Separately, 7 low-tolerance colonies were crossed with each other. All of it timed to the corals' natural mass spawning nights. The resulting baby corals were raised in nurseries, first in tanks, then out on the reef itself, for 3 to 4 years until they were finally adults, old enough to be tested the exact same way their parents had been. So after years of waiting for those offspring to grow up, what did the team actually find once they finally ran them through the same heat stress their parents had faced? The offspring of the 2 heat-tolerant parents came out noticeably tougher than the offspring of the 2 heat-sensitive parents. On average, the tolerant lineage could withstand roughly 1 extra degree week of heat stress before showing the same level of bleaching and death. That is a small number on paper, but it translates into a real, measurable genetic effect. The researchers calculated what is called narrow-sense heritability, the fraction of the difference in heat tolerance between corals that is explained by their genes rather than by chance. For the short, sharp heatwave, heritability came out at 0.29. For the longer, month-scale heatwave, it came out at 0.23. In plain terms, somewhere between a quarter and a third of a coral's ability to survive a marine heatwave traces directly back to its parents. That is the first time anyone had shown this in adult coral colonies that had actually been raised all the way to reproductive maturity, not just as tiny larvae in a dish. But the study also turned up something the researchers had not expected, and it complicates the whole picture. Breeding corals to survive the short, sharp heat spike did not make their offspring any better at surviving the long, drawn-out heat wave. The two traits showed essentially no genetic correlation with each other. A coral bred specifically to shrug off one intense week of heat could still die in a heat wave that dragged on for a month, which happens to be the kind of heat wave that does the most damage on real reefs. That matters a lot in practice, because the short, week-long stress test is the fast, cheap way to screen large numbers of coral colonies. The long, month-scale test that matters most for predicting real-world survival is expensive, slow, and hard to run at any meaningful scale. The researchers were also candid about the limits of their own results. Breeding and raising coral all the way to reproductive adulthood takes years, so they could not repeat the experiment across multiple generations or multiple coral populations. That means they cannot completely rule out that some of the difference between the two groups came down to ordinary genetic drift, random shifts in which genes got passed along, rather than the selective breeding itself. And the size of the improvement they measured, about 1 extra degree week of tolerance, is modest when you set it next to how fast the ocean is projected to keep warming over the coming decades. So where does that leave assisted evolution as a strategy? The researchers frame it as one genuinely useful tool, not a fix on its own. Heat tolerance in adult coral is real, it is measurable, and it can be bred for. But breeding tougher coral only buys time if reef managers also deal with the local pressures making reefs weaker in the first place. Pollution runoff, overfishing, and coastal development that strips away the habitat corals need to recover between heat waves. And ultimately, the researchers are blunt about the ceiling on all of this. No amount of selective breeding will let coral out-evolve an ocean that keeps warming faster than any breeding program can keep up with. The window for that only stays open if global emissions come down, and soon.